buenas tardes. Es un gusto tenerlos acá en esta presentación del doctor Kristupas Sabolius sobre la teoría de la imaginación de Gilbert Simondon, que lleva el título La teoría de la imaginación cíclica de Gilbert Simondon. Voy a tomar un momento para presentar al doctor Sabolius, que les agradezco mucho que esté con nosotros y espero que esto sea la continuación de más colaboraciones. Ya me tocó a mí ser invitado en Digna y pues bueno, me da gusto recibirlo ahora acá, así que bueno. El doctor Sabolius es investigador afiliado por el MIT en Estados Unidos y profesor de filosofía en la Universidad de Vilna, Lituania. Es autor de On the Real, Imagination and Matter, Proteus and the Radical Imagination, The Imaginary y Full Sleep, Imagination and Phenomenology. Así como numerosos ensayos en los que señala la función contradictoria de la imaginación que aparece en todas las principales teorías del pensamiento occidental. También es un activo intelectual público, escritor de novelas, obras de teatro y guiones, entre ellos de Gilbert, nominada a la Universidad Lituana en la categoría de lengua extranjera en los Oscars de 2015. Pues, bueno, muchas gracias, disculpas, y te cedo la palabra.
Muchas gracias. No puedo hablar en español, porque entiendo un poco, pero no voy a hablar en inglés. No hablo muy mal. Muchas gracias.
And por las preguntas finales, la maestra Baroni va a ayudarnos a hacer traducción para que sea más dinámica la parte de preguntas y respuestas. Perdón, ahora sí está. Sí.
Sí, gracias Sebastián, gracias Teresa, a todos los amigos de esta universidad. So thank you everyone. I'm really glad to be here, to be back, and also to see Mexican friends. I hope it is the beginning and the continuation of a beautiful friendship. We shall be doing things together in future as well. And I'm happy to be invited to speak today about Gilbert Simondon's theory of cyclic imagination. I will initially say a few things why it is important maybe to draw attention to this theory right now, at this particular moment. But I would like to start from a very short story how I got acquainted with Simondon. I guess now everybody is like really into Simondon. I'm not sure here in Mexico, but I think there's increasing interest everywhere. Yeah, and everybody knows that Simondon is a thinker of technology, of technical objects, and he became famous in France, especially, but later on in Italy, in all the parts of the world, as a thinker of technology. Although several people knew that he was developing, and he graduated and wrote a master's thesis and PhD on the individuation, and had a very interesting theory, ontologically interesting theory of individuation. So only later on we discovered the book, which was released in France only in the second part of the 20th century, which was entitled Individuation in the Light of Forms. And later on, nobody kind of paid attention to the question of imagination in Simondon. Can we change the slide? Yeah. So basically, the theory I will be talking today about was developed in 65, 66, as you can see in the high part of the slide. This theory is based on the lectures that Gilbert Simondon gave at Sorbonne And he also kind of, by bringing in this theory, he reacted to the landscape of the theories of imagination in psychology and in philosophy that were going on at that time in France. However, the actual release of the book in France happened only, as you see, 2008. So until 2008, basically even in France, nobody was talking about this theory. Although many knew about it, but it was unknown for the general public. The release in Spanish, I think, was in 2015. I'm not sure if it's the only release. I found the data, but I think it was in Argentina, if I'm not mistaken, this publication. And in English, the English translation appeared in 2022, actually in 2023. It's like in January of this year. So as you see, there is a kind of a lot of novelty in the attention we can put on this theory, and the reason why it was forgotten, or at least not really interpreted, is, I think it's very ambiguous. I think, first of all, the more I read Simondon, the more I blame Gilles Deleuze of basically maybe even admitting that he was influenced by Simondon, but really never giving a proper attention to his theory. And only Bernard Stiegler, who openly declared that his theory of imagination was really affected by Simondon, was the one who kind of stimulated, I think, the appearance of this theory to the general public. And I have to admit that also Stiegler, I invited Stiegler to Vilna University. It's funny that in Spanish, Vilna is, is a proper name for Vilnius, but it's a Jewish name for Vilnius. So it's a University of Vilna. It's like, sounds like the Jewish interpretation of Vilnius. So it's nice. Okay, so I invited Stiegler once to the conference in Vilna, and he said, we talked about his sphere of imagination at length. And as you know, Stiegler is a thinker of technology as well, and he has this particular interest in imagination in terms of cinematic consciousness. And I said, okay, Bernard, we were walking through the streets of Vilnius, and I said, so where does this theory come from? What's the greatest influence? And we talked about Husserl, about Kant, about all the major names in the Western philosophy. But properly speaking, you need to read Simondon and exactly this book to understand my theory of imagination and my take on imagination. I said, I've never, it was in 2012 maybe, I've never, got acquainted with anything that Simondon wrote on imagination, I said at that time. So you need to read it, he said. And I was looking for the book, it was difficult to find, and they sent it from Paris to me, and I read and I understood that it's really a thing to discuss. It's a really important work that we need to discuss today. Can we change the focus? Why is that? Why should we pay appropriate attention to Simondon's theory? We can move on. Yeah. First of all, I would like to frame this theory in the general context of a variety of theories of imagination. So let's say from ancient Greek philosophy, we have like in Plato and Aristotle, and later on also in Mid Ages and in philosophy of modernity, we have a tendency through all these periods to think imagination I would say in two ways. There are two typologies how you think imagination. The first typology is to look for the isolation of the procedures of imagination in contrast to perception, reality, truth, or whatever. So we can find this, of course, already in Plato. I didn't write Plato because it was, okay, there are cases where Plato is ambiguous. But for instance, in René Descartes, you can see it clearly. I will demonstrate through an example that you need to separate imagination from the intellect. Imagination is something that impedes a proper cognitive process. You know? So you need clara distincta perceptio, which is not based on imagination. You know? The same you find, for instance, in Husserl. Edmund Husserl, phenomenologist, who paid a lot of attention to the question of fantasy, Bildbewusstsein. The 23rd volume of Husserliana is dedicated to the question of imagination and fantasy and picture consciousness, as he puts it. But in all these cases, and it's a highly influential work, you know, which laid ground for the whole interpretation of imagination in phenomenology. But in this work, Husserl tries to separate clearly the regime of fantasy, the regime of memory, the regime of perception, you know, and he looks for differences. So what you have as a background here is the idea that imagination is something specific and it shouldn't be intermingled with perception in any way, you know. The same for Sartre. You know, I will talk about Sartre a bit because it's an important point of reference later on. But for Sartre, generally speaking, imagination and perception are even genetically different types of consciousness. On the other hand, there is a tendency in different theories to interpret imagination, bless you, even through the, you know, if you think, for instance, of cataleptic fantasy in Stoics, you know, catalepsis, the idea of catalepsis in Stoicism, where you katalambane, you know, from ancient Greek, where you interpret all the given sensory data through a process of grasping, you know. So there are fantasia catalepticae. We would need to translate it as an impression of impressions that appropriately grasp, truthful impressions. So they are called fantasies. For Stoics, all the world is conceived through fantasy, while parts of the world can be conceived properly because we have this capacity to grasp in fantasy. So catalambining, you know, fantasia catalepticae is a modality of fantasy that gives us truth, in a way. The same regards Immanuel Kant. I don't want to speak about Kant today because we won't manage to arrive to Simondon, but you know, the schematism, the theory of schematism, the theory of a priorism is based on the idea that Einbildungskraft, you know, that the imagination brings forth the schemes of perceptions that enable any kind of cognitive processes. So basically, in these cases, we find the idea of imagination which precedes perception and coordinates perception. So there is no distinction between, the clear distinction between imagination and perception, where it is the part and the modality of our relation to the world in the cognitive processes. And also in this one, Bachelard, and it's even further. Bachelard puts it in a way that we can understand imagination as a specific way to relate ourselves to the matter. You know, he speaks about poetic imagination, but he also allows us to understand that imagination can bring us, especially in temporal terms, he puts a lot of emphasis on the rhythms, on the resonances of reverberation, where we can understand matter, materiality, through imagination better, because we feel the resonance of the matter around us. So basically, in the first case, we try to isolate imagination from perception and reality. In the second case, we try to associate and to see how imagination works within perception and how it brings us to the processes of the real. Let's move on. I will quickly bring one example. Okay, this comes from Descartes. In Descartes, in meditation, we found an example where he says that we cannot understand the difference between kilogram and milligram, the figures of 1,000 and 10,000 angles, in visualizing through imagination. Because for us, as you see here, this is an example of kilogram, the figure of 1,000 angles. It looks like it's indiscernible, you know? It looks round. So visually, we are unable to understand which figure is of 999 or 1001 angles, but we can understand this conceptually, you know? Let's move on. So basically, for him, this inability of imagination to conceive the difference between kilogram, the figure of 1,000 angles, and milligram, the figure of 10,000 angles, because for us it looks the same, it's like round, is the incapacity of imagination to be compared to the intellect. You know? Only intellect can provide us this understanding, the proper understanding. Let's move on. Yeah. In Sartre, and I would say a few words on Sartre, because Sartre was basically the nemesis of Simondon, in a way. He fighted Sartre in his work. In Sartre, we find a very influential theory that is both psychological and phenomenological. And in this case, we speak about the negation and irrealization as two major functions of imagination. So basically, what does imagination do is it negates the processes of perception in a way that it creates a different type of consciousness. It's a very interesting, I think it's a very radical concept of imagination, because it distantiates from reality in a way that you even go to the point where Sartre discovers through imagination the idea of le néant, you know, so of nothingness, and then later on I think he starts writing his major work on the nothingness and being by considering the idea of imagination. Because the idea of le néant, of nothingness, appears in his work on imagination. And it also in this work, he starts to relate the freedom of human being with imagination and with the creation of possibilities. He says human being can be conceived as free only because he can negate reality, you know, through the negation and through seeing a radically different possibility. You know? So this is what imagination does. radically different possibility comes through negation. And he even proposes, which is a very important point for Simondon, to understand imagination not as a specific regime of consciousness or modality of consciousness, but as a conscience imaginaire, which is imagining consciousness, a certain typology, a type of consciousness. It's not like, let's say, well, the way consciousness deals with those contents or with those acts, but it's different consciousness. When we enter the regime of imagination, it's completely different regime than the regime of perception. So it's a different consciousness. And it is characterized through the abyss, through a detachment from the matter. So this is isolationism at its best. You know, it's like you isolate yourself from anything. Let's move on. That's the quote from Sartre: "The object of perception constantly overflows consciousness. The object of an image, on the contrary, yeah, is never anything more than the consciousness one has of it. It is defined by that consciousness. One can never learn from an image what one does not know already." Meaning that all the knowledge that we have in imagination is hermetic. You know, you don't learn anything in imagination. You don't contact with the world in imagination. You are just in your kind of illusionary world, locked in, and you don't get in touch with the reality anyway. So that's the crucial point when we need to move to the Simondon. For Simondon, okay, let's go on. It is exactly the question, how can we relate ourselves to the world through imagination? And that's why his work is called Imagination and Invention. So Simondon thinks about the process of imagining not in separation. For instance, you can interpret imagination through procedures of reproduction and memory. You know, you kind of memorize something and you can invoke something in your memory, like the moments, the acts of imagination that relate to your memory. Or you can think of imagination in terms of productivity and creation. You know, I need to create something and envision that has never existed. So for Simondon, all these things are related, you know, and intertwined and genetically linked to each other. But moreover, most importantly, he thinks that imagination is intertwined with the process of invention. So basically, whenever you imagine, you even in the face of let's say reproductive imagination, you already have this disposal of invention. You already kind of he calls it amplification of a given data. You know? Every imagination can be amplified with their factor of invention, and the factor of invention leads you to the relation with the world and the matter. So basically, since imagination is always inventive, you always keep in touch with the real world, in a way, because you want to, in a way, to change it into inventive whenever you imagine. Even on the mode of existence of technical objects, this major work, you know, that we talked previously about, we find this idea that the reason the living being can invent is because it is an individual being that carries its associated milieu with it. So what he means by it is that every living being, not a human being, every living being. That's an important thing. So we can notice that for Simondon, even from his earlier work, the question of creativity and invention and imagination is the question of every living being, of life in general. So the first thing is that every living being can invent. Basically, every living being is creative. The second point is that creativity and imagination and invention should be linked with milieu, the idea of milieu. I know that we can translate milieu also as an environment, but it's false in a way, because even in English translation you use the French word. Milieu means in the middle in French, being in the middle. So for Simondon, this idea of being always in the middle becomes crucial in understanding his theory of imagination. You are always outside yourself. You are always in the middle. And you always need to think relations in order to understand imagination and creativity. That's totally different than, for instance, in Sartre. For Sartre, you're locked in your subjectivity. You never consider your milieu. Even for Kant, the transcendental subject doesn't have a milieu, properly speaking. So basically, that's a very important point that we'll be circling around. Let's move on. So these are the key assumptions of his theory. That we need to take into consideration in order to see how complex his work is. So what he does, he starts in the beginnings, like in the introduction of his work, he starts speaking about imagination that works at the level of relations, but not of representations. Meaning that the first error we commit when we try to understand imagination is to look for the content of imagination, of imaginary representations. Whereas for Simondon, imagination is always the process, the genesis, and the movement. So in order to understand this, let's say, genetic part of imagination, we need to abandon the idea of representation. That what is represented is really an imaginary, let's say, essence. So it's a relational idea of imagination. Secondly, it's a very interesting point. For Simondon, imagination is something that resists your individuality and subjectivity. He kind of acknowledges that there is a certain independence in imagination which doesn't come from, let's say, your even subconscious or your, if you interpret it through a Lacanian lens, your hidden drives of Freud, in psychoanalysis, something, or your neuroses. It's not like, independence of from your ego, properly speaking. It's that independence which comes from material origin of imagination. In one passage, I didn't put a slide, but I had it beforehand. In one passage, he has a very interesting idea that imagination is like the materiality that intrudes consciousness as uncontrollable anticipation, and practically when you hallucinate, and if it's not controlled, it leads you to hallucination. It kind of expresses the explosion of the matter in the consciousness. So when you hallucinate, it's the materiality that works inside you. It's a very, a radical idea. He doesn't develop it a lot. There are a few passages in this book. But for him, the independence of imagination, what I want to stress out, is related to its to imagination's origin out of the matter, out of materiality, not out of your secluded consciousness. Thirdly, imagination, through its independence, through its relative independence, cannot be governed by the subject totally. It's partly independent, and it maintains a certain opacity. So we cannot even properly understand what we see, what we imagine. So it's a constant dialectics with imaginary content. And also he calls images as secondary organisms, parasites, the surplus of consciousness, secondary monads, reinterpreting Leibniz and so on. So basically, it's something alien in us. It's the otherness that we constantly dealing. It's not a total otherness, but a partial otherness that intervenes into the processes that are controlled by us. So basically, that's why we have so many troubles in describing imagination, because it's not properly us, it's something else that also at work here. This is a quote: images sometimes are inhabiting the subject, other times leading it. So basically, it's like constant fluxes. Okay, let's move on. The important thing here is to understand that images should be always put in the framework of this intermediary status. They're never belonging to the subjectivity, properly speaking. Neither are they representatives of some other world. So intermediarity, intermediary being, is what characterizes images. And one remark, when Simondon starts basically developing his theory, in the beginning, in the first pages, he speaks about imagination. But later on, I think, namely because he criticizes Sartre, he abandons the word imagination and speaks only about images. And I think this is the reason why we can see this proper contrast with Sartre, because for Sartre kind of hijacked the word of imagination in the French-speaking context. So basically, he wanted to find another word. So he was like trying to use both, but later on he speaks about images. But for him, images doesn't have any visual meaning. It's not visualizations. Images, as I said, are relations, are the moments of creativity and creative genesis that kind of influence, coordinate our all processes of cognition. So basically, images or imaginations are in between the objective and subjective. So basically, they are this relation. They're not the subject's projection to the object. They are relation between the subject and the object. So that in the middle, in the milieu. They are found between the concrete and the abstract. They are never totally abstract and then never totally concrete, And they should be located between the self and the world. So all the time this intermediary status, which is emphasized. Okay, let's move. A few other things that are important. So this is the theory of imagination that points to basically the biological meaning of imagination, meaning that we discover imagination in the processes of life at all levels. He gives a lot of examples from ethologists, from biology, and he never speaks of a human imagination unless we talk about symbolic function. But for Simondon, the symbolic function, which is discovered and described properly in humans, is developed through these phases we will be seeing later on from the biological level. Basically, it has a direct link with biology. And he even says that it may be that animals have their own symbolic world, but we cannot properly understand it and decipher it, you know. But this doesn't mean that they don't have a symbolic face. We will be speaking later on about. So basically, every living being can imagine, and basically, and namely because it's not about visualization and symbolization. These are only faces. Secondly, imagination can be understood as cyclical, namely because it describes the relation between the living being and milieu. So it's a circulate. Where does the circle appears? It's like the circle between an organism, a living being, an entity, and its milieu, and its surrounding, its environment. Yeah. Let's move on. And for Simondon, this idea of an image is he compares it with an embryo. With even images have their phases of genesis. They are like some organisms that are themselves born in the interaction between organism and milieu, and they have their own biological development. So as if there is a biology within a biology, So he speaks about imagination as the function or an important factor in biological being, but as well, imagination itself is understood biologically through the development. It's we can describe imagination only as development. So basically, that's why images they intervene us, they are part of us, but also they're always tertiary. They do not fall into the binary structures. So they resist strict oppositions. They do not fall under the determination of intellect. So they avoid clear determinations. And they constantly propose, and that's why the creativity is possible, basically, because it always explode, and push forward binaries. You set the binaries, but the images destroy them, or at least impede the limits you put on them. So basically, it's a very dynamic and very dialectical process that you enter when you imagine, because it's a resistance, it's the avoidance of determinations, it's the trying to change something, but constantly feeling that this change is possible only in the dialogue with some otherness. So basically, you're constantly in this choreography with the world. That's what is imagination. And interestingly, it's only through imagination that you can include otherness. So think of Star Trek again. In imagination, you don't find anything else than yourself. But in this case, you can include otherness only because you imagine, because you interact with the milieu. So basically, and this is not a simple process. Basically, you imagine because you want to transform your milieu, but what happens? milieu transforms you. You know? So basically that's how the possibility of inclusion of otherness appears. Because it's not a simple process, I accept otherness. You never accept otherness, you transform otherness by transforming yourself. And that's where, you know, the cycle goes on and goes on and goes on. So it's, I won't be speaking about these technical elements of how does it happen, because it will take too much time. But it's a metastable process. The idea of metastability appears also on his work of individuation, and he describes it at length. But I don't want to complicate it too much here. So basically, that's why if an image is an embryo that acquires different functions as it grows and mutates. So you kind of start imagining, and we will see the first phase, the second phase, the third, and the fourth. There are 4 phases. But basically, in every case, in every phase, an image has a different function. It's never the same. You know, it's like it's growing, evolving. Okay, let's move on. How much time do I have? Because, you know, yeah? Okay. Because I'm kind of in the middle. So, but I can speed up later on. An important point here is to say a few words about the idea of milieu. This is the quote from his work on ideation, not from his work on imagination. So, milieu for Simondon is something that we always not really are in there. You know? We are not in the milieu. Milieu basically is us. You know? We need to shift this perspective. That we never speak about milieu from the point of surroundings. That's why the idea of environment is erroneous. You know, it's around us. No. Milieu is already there. You know, we are partly milieu. And that's related with the idea of individuation. As you know, in Simondon, individuation means that individual is only the face. So the stable individual is only the face which can be described, which can be interpreted, which was heavily used by helomorphic metaphysics in Aristotle. He's the critic of Aristotle. You know, he says that helomorphism was false, and namely because it provided this idea of the individual. What we miss with the idea of individual is this pre-individual being. You know? And what is pre-individual being? It's the milieu also, but for Simondon, it is both relations and potentiality. You know? So we cannot understand individual unless we see its relational being. And the more we understand, articulate, and bring forward the relations, the more we can say about its potentiality. And now have in mind Aristotle. No? For Aristotle, the dunamis and the energeia, potential and actualization is inside an individual. No? It's a substance. Here you have a potentiality always outside. No? So basically it's your relational being. As you know, many relations you can understand, the more strata of relations you can, let's say, interpret, and the more intensively you live your relations, the better you articulate your relation with the milieu, and I would add here, the more creative you are, the more imaginary you are. So basically, relations define your creativity. And here is the quote: the individual would then be grasped as a relative reality, a certain phase of being, which supposes a pre-individual reality. So individual presupposes pre-individual reality, prior to it, and which, even after individuation, does not fully exist all by itself. For individuation does not exhaust in a single stroke the potentials of pre-individual reality. So basically, you kind of, by living, you fulfill your potential, which is around you in the pre-individual milieu, but you never exhaust it, you know? It's never fully accomplished. And moreover, what individuation manifests is not merely the individual, but the individual milieu coupling. So basically, in other cases, he says subject is individual plus milieu. You know? So there is this coupling. We need to think about coupling, you know, of individual and milieu. Let's move on. So this is how we arrive at one of the most important points. What do we do when we imagine? We, on the one hand, it is a process of a change within the systematicity of the individual. It's the metamorphosis of the individual. So I change myself when I imagine, but only because I try to change the environment, so the milieu. And the transformation of milieu happens there. You know? So basically, it's the change that occurs on both levels. You transform milieu, but you don't even notice that by the transforming the milieu, you transform yourself. It's both transformation and metamorphosis. Let's move on, maybe. And these are the famous 4 phases that we find in the book. The book is, has these chapters. Every chapter is dedicated to each phase. So the first one is anticipation. The second one is perception. The third one is recollection and symbolization. And the fourth one is invention, which is a game, since it's a cycle, is a new anticipation. So basically what you do is you move, by imagining, you move in cycles, but also, as you see, there's this moment of amplification here, you know? So it's not, you move in cycles, meaning that you are at the same spot, you know, you don't go anywhere. No, you amplify. So the moment of transformation is marked by this amplification, this centrifugation of the process. So we can move on. And each case has its own characteristics. So starting from anticipation, I think that's a very intriguing point. I will not speak at length because it's a lot, you know, but I will mention a few things. So the first phase is anticipation, and it's a very important point in the discussion with all the evolutionary biologists. And since he was a good biologist and a good scientist, he knew a lot of, he read and interpreted a lot of physics, chemistry, and biology, so, and let alone psychology. So that's why his work is so impressive, you know, of the scale, of the range he can absorb. So he discusses with ethology and evolutionary theories. You know, in evolutionary theory, we have this idea of adaptation. So let's say living being adapts to the milieu, and that's why evolution occurs. Okay, for him, for Simondon, it's an important point, but he says even previously, even before adaptation, we have a moment within the functioning of mentality, of the mind, of let's say biological disposition towards the world, which is not merely adaptation, but anticipation, where he describes, through various examples, anticipation that is both, let's say, a creative interpretation of situation and adaptation, and like basically genetically prepared for the situation that will happen, but at the same time, for instance, he says all animals have curiosity, and that's why they experiment with the milieu, with the situation. So it's not that you only adapt, you respond like a machine, but you always play with the possibility of adaptation. So that's why anticipation is already creative, because you exploit possibilities. You just not like two halves of an orange that you put together. You do not adapt by calculating all the variables around you and say, okay, I need to do this. But because you have this creative take, you may transform your environment. You may see, maybe, he says, where the freedom of an animal, or let's say of any living being occurs, between the danger and curiosity. Danger is always about adaptation, and saying, no, it may be dangerous. But you're also curious. And all the animals are both between danger and curiosity, So you can observe it easily. So basically that's where anticipation becomes creative. And then in perception, he speaks about perception as an imaginary process. He says there are intraperceptive images that kind of, basically it's pretty similar to Kant's schematism, saying that you have what he calls intraperceptive images. Is like schemata in Kant. You accept like signals incoming from the world, and you create the schemes how to respond to them. But this is the work of imagination, like in Kant. Later on, interestingly, we create the world of memories and symbols on the basis of anticipation, perception, of perceptual schemata. We create the analogon of the milieu. So what is our mental world? It is a symbolic and emotional expression of milieu in the mentality. So basically, milieu turns into the mind through symbols and emotions, through a kind of constellation, the architecture of mind that you construct. And the interesting point here is that this tendency of turning, the milieu into symbolic environment is observed even in let's say, animals or all living beings that want to acquire the knowledge of the territory. He says that milieu turns into the territory when you start to understand it. So basically, you kind of own the territory when you own the milieu when it's turned into territory. Let's say this. And later on, based on that, you invent. So when you invent in human being world, it's starting from technology. So technology is the articulation of your tendency to change the environment. That's why you need tools, basically. You want to change milieu. And of course, what happens later on, that the invention and the transformation of milieu affects your anticipations. So this moment, I think this is where Bernard Stiegler is born, basically, at this point. Technology invents human beings. So I would say that Stiegler starts the cycle from here, and Simondon from here, you know. So he says that Stigler says that technology invents human being, you know, basically that architecticity is the basis of our human existence. But for Simondon, it's you know just another emphasis. We transform our anticipations because technology has this temporal and organizational moment. You know, we see the world differently because we invented something. So if I have a tool, I will see it through the eyes of the tool, you know, through the regimes of the tool. So basically, anticipation and invention basically coincide here at this point. Okay, let's move on. There are a few things maybe I can say here and stop and we can discuss because I still have several chapters of this, but maybe we can start the discussion. I mentioned already about the uncontrollable anticipations. And I mentioned that anticipation is a very important moment in this theory. This is why we can say that his theory analyzes biological tendency to be creative and biological tendency to articulate life through, let's say, vitalist procedures. You know? So, in biological sense, imagination is inevitable. It's the motor of life, in a way. That's why it is already rooted in all the functions of organism, as well as we can see that organism is in disposition both to change the environment and the self. So basically that's how evolution happens. You know, that's why evolution is possible. On the other hand, that's the drama of the human beings, because we elevated this tendency to transform the environment by transforming ourselves to the face of, let's say, Anthropocene we're living. You know, so that's why we transform our environment in that manner. That we already kind of disconnect ourselves from the milieu. It grew up into, and that's my interpretation, I would say, you know, because why Simondon is important today. Because we can see the question of Anthropocene and environmental problems as the process that has started on the biological level, but went too far in a way. And we need to rediscover these primary phases, you know, of imaginary interaction. And also, the other thing that is important is that we are not only responsive beings, and by saying we, I mean all the living beings. So imagination is prior to stimuli. It's prior to the scheme of stimulus response. It's always, you know, in this process of circling, anticipating the stimulus. Okay, let's see what I have left here. Maybe the next. I have this, it's a long case, but maybe you have questions here. We can stop here. And this is, yeah.
Also, this compositing problem and then aesthetics.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be nice to hear something about those topics.
Let's start discussion, you say, yeah?
Or maybe you could make a few points about composibility and aesthetics.
Okay.
So this example is nice.
Yeah. It's so let's move on. Let's move some slides. Okay. And now move on. Composibility. Yeah. So the combustibility is another interesting point. I have to say, that Simondon doesn't speak too much about combustibility. It's like several pages. But I think, for me, when I first read his book, it was a groundbreaking discovery. Because the problem of possibility, as you see, is at the core of the problem of imagination. I already mentioned Sartre. What is possibility for Sartre? It's the basis of truth. How you of freedom, sorry. How you discover possibility only in imagination. You see a radical alternative only because you can imagine. As well in Husserl, and this comes very late in Sartre's work. He starts from let's say, describing some features of imagination, and then he discusses. But it's about possibility. The same happened with Husserl, for instance. He speaks about fantasy, about memory, and so on. But when you read his 23rd volume, at the very end, that's a collection of texts from different years. At the very end, he starts speaking only about possibilities. Imagination is about possibilities, and the whole project of phenomenology is about epoche, of sustaining yourself from the belief in the world, and in a way, it's the play with possibilities of the experience. The same you find in Kant. What is transcendentalism? It's the possibility of experience, and then, especially in the first edition of the critique of pure reason, you find this idea that imagination is at the core. It's a temporal synthesis. There are three temporal syntheses, and imagination is basically at the core of this process, which brings them later on for Heidegger the possibility to speak and Bildungskraft as Dasein, imagination is almost a Dasein, and so on. So basically, very often, when you start analyzing the idea of imagination, you come across that it's not about images, it's about possibilities, So it's a possibilitation of our experience, because you can see alternatives, you can detach, you can transform, so it's the work with potentiality and possibility. The same regards Simondon, but for him it was already in the beginning. He says, imagination, it's about the relation with milieu, So if it's a relation with milieu, it means it's about the potentiality which is outside. But then there is a very specific point, which is let's move on, which is kind of in the part that is related to a perception, the second phase. He starts speaking about the compossibilities. And he says it's a very specific case of imagination. When the image system, the image is the system of compossibility of states. Incidental information intervenes as an element of decision in this compossibility. So first of all, to understand what he means here, it's a complicated quote. We need to see what is the idea of compossibility. It comes mainly from Leibniz. Let's move on. The quote from Leibniz. Leibniz had this idea of harmonious world, as you know, the best of all possibles. It's hardcore metaphysics, but in this metaphysics, he discovered that not all possibilities are possible in a way. If you want a harmonious world, you need to think about compossibilities, that meaning a shared world of possibilities,
that would allow the substances to coexist. You know? So the idea of harmony is based on shared possibility, meaning compossibility. Yeah? So basically, that's the quote from his letter to a friend. The universe is a collection of a certain order of compossibilities only, and the actual universe is a collection of all the possibles which exist. That is to say, those which form the richest composite. You know? So basically, and this idea later on is like taken in analytical philosophy, in logics, but also in Deleuze and in Simondon. Let's see the next slide. Simondon starts speaking about compossibilities when he says that there are moments in our perception when, at one glance, we have such a richness of image, and when he says image here, he means perception, you know? Such a richness of perception that we can basically differentiate all the nuances at one glance. You know? So basically, you can. He provides a few examples. For instance, a mother can see that child is sick because just one glance, you know. Or a shepherd can see that the sheep are missing because, you know, he didn't count. You know, say, oh no, someone is missing, you know, because he knows that very well. One image of the whole crowd of how it should appear, you know. So there are, and there are, you know, and the same regards, you know, other living beings. So we have this ability to interpret the surrounding milieu in its richness, in its and having in mind the differences inside, and he calls it differential perception. You know, so the perception that amounts a lot of differences, only because we have in mind the shared system of compossibilities. So the basis of this intense relation with the environment, when the environment is clear to us like at glance, is the compossibilities we live through, basically. So for him, it's not about harmony. He is not the thinker of harmony. So it's like it's only the idea that comes from Leibniz. For him, the idea of compossibility is the idea of intense relationality. So where I share my possibilities with your possibilities, and only under the basis of this, I can have this. He says intuition. Intuition is based on compossibilities. I can clearly see, I can clearly understand, I can just have this grasping of the world. Only I have this moment of compossibilities. So, and he doesn't develop this too much, but my project can move later on to see, and my project is, I'm writing a few things on this, is I think it's a very important idea that can be developed further into the idea of not only cyclical genetic imagination, but also compossible imagination, which is, let's say, ecologically charged imagination. You know? What does it mean to think relations and imagine relations? And that's, I think, a recurrent critique for post-human Trojan is like, okay, we can never abandon our humanity, we can never leave our state of being humans, we will always project the image of otherness, you know, by paying attention to animals, to environment, and we will pretend being as if, you know, let's say, post-humanistically orientated. So in this case, I think it provides an interesting alternative, saying that you don't think about the essence of the otherness. You think about the intense relationality with the otherness. So the problem is not the nature of otherness. The problem is how many and how intense there are the relations that and shared possibilities with otherness. You know? And that's an interesting point, because I'm very interested into the theories also of indigenous thought and anthropology, like Villegas de Castro and others. Now I read a lot of Moirat as well, who is a fellow colleague from the Museum of Anthropology. In these cases, you know, they kind of even sometimes use Latour to interpret this. They say in multinaturalist stance, which is like for De Castro is the idea of indigenous ontologies. No? In multinaturalist stance, you don't interpret nature. You don't have problem with essence of otherness. You have problem with how you deal with relations. You know, how many and what are the quality of relations. You know. So basically, in indigenous interpretation of the ontologist in this case, is the question how to basically articulate, see, and enter, and also understand them as possibilities, these relations. And that's, I think, a very interesting and a very fruitful moment, at least for me. This is the thread of line I'm trying to work with. To interpret relations as possibilities, or rather as compossibilities, you know? And that's where your egocentric imagination starts going down, you know? And it's like, it's not about my fantasy towards the other. It's like trying to understand the possibility you share with the other in that way that you can have this understanding of differential perception. It's about perception. It's the imagination that leads to the perception. It's the most intense perception. And I think that's the beauty of it. We don't talk about utopia or like fictions. We talk about intensive perception, which is based on that shared possibility space. So that's the point I was trying to make, and that's basically the moment I took out of Simondon and developing this further now in my writings, in my book. There are several that appear there. So one in Italian and the other maybe in English. So I'll keep you updated. Okay, and the other point you wanted to, but that's a bit further on about Latour and critical zones and aesthetics, yeah?
So maybe you feel already...
So I would say, let's start the discussion and let's see how it goes. Maybe I can bring in a few things later. Okay? So thank you so much.
So again, thank you, Kristupas, for your generous presentation. I really want to go to the composition because I know one of the topics you really are into it. So vamos a ver la discusión y ya se quieran platicar o presentar la pregunta en español o en inglés. Tenemos aquí la maestra Palomín para que nos apoye por si hay diálogos interculturales. ¿Alguna duda?
same happens in my country as well.
I have a question.
Sure.
I was wondering, you were saying how you made a point about how imagination and the way you're thinking it is not primarily visual, and that's how you can relate it to other forms of living beings that are not primarily visual. Can you expand a little bit on that idea?
Of course, it's a very important point, and basically I think it's the point where all the drama of imagination occurs, you know. Bachelard had made this very clearly, said a clear image kills imagination, you know. And especially a formal and defined image kills imagination. And this deals with the problem of, let's say, we have several moments. One moment is the problem of representation, you know. So basically, we, when we imagine, due to oculocentric history of our civilization, let's say, meaning that we have, especially in Europe and in Americas, we had this importance of image in order to represent. You know, there is this relation of image and representation, which grew exponentially through ages, you know, and we kind of, I'm inclined to think that in order to have a clara distincta perceptio, you know, we need to have two things. We need clear image and narrative explanation. So, since the words are related to language, we tend to think that images are related to imagination, visual images. So there is this difference between imagery and imagination, you know. And if you follow both image theories, and starting from Wittgenstein and Mitchell and, you know, all the discussions with Gottfried Böhm and so on, there's this tendency to separate the image from the work, you know, from the narrative structures. There's this tendency to think image in separation from the narrative structures. But we cannot escape it. I think in Rancière we find it. He says there is this image sentence duo, phrase image, you know, which defines the way we imagine. We can think of representation as governed by words and illustrated by images, or we can try to liberate images from the words, but we kind of still be inclined to see anything. But here, with the problem of imagination, we come across with, you know, first of all, the relation of imagination between all the sensory experiences and their differences. Be it, for instance, odor or tactile experiences, you know. You can also imagine music. You can imagine how you are touching something. You can imagine perfumes, you know. So basically, imagination is never about images. And the imagination of music is a whole different thing. It's a very interesting topic. So basically, first of all, we tend to downplay imagination to the scheme of narrative and image, whereas it's not only one point. The second point is, and that's what I'm trying already to expose, but maybe we need to discuss it further. In my understanding, imagination is an interface of possibilities, let's say. You work with possibilities. And when you work with possibilities, and when you understand imagination through this lens of possibilitization, of potentiality, that you encounter potentiality in imagination. So you start realizing that, for instance, living beings that do not have symbolic representation in images and words can also have their possibilitation of the world. They encounter possibilities through their way of imagination. It's because ancient Greeks had this idea of eikasia, which is imaginatio, and in Latin, we think that imagination is only images. But it's not. It is primarily the way to encounter possibilities. So basically that's why when you start analyzing imagination, you move on in discovering that, it's not only images, it's also images. And the other thing is that images and words basically influence so heavily imagination that we start structuring according to the scheme of this narrative and visual interaction. So as in the Simondonian example of key phases, of the fourth phase is invention. Invention occurs by providing a lot in the human world, by providing a lot of linguistic and visual structures. So they kind of start coordinating your anticipations, and your imagination becomes more and more visual and narrative at the same time. But that's only, let's say, one path. And this path doesn't allow us to see other options, especially in terms of other living beings.
Well, I think.
Yeah. I have a question.
Sure. Para que se grabe.
Okay.
Sí, porque si no nada más escucha la respuesta en
Yeah, I have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
It's about all these possibilities, and that is come from an individual, right? And not from the universal, understood by the Kantian philosophy, for example, and they come from always for the subjectivity. That is the question. Thank you.
Where do they come from?
Yeah, it's come from the individual. It's come from the subjectivity, and now to be an imaginary from the collective or universal or something more complex that construct the world.
But maybe I can draw something here.
I think so.
If we have.
I think I have a way.
But not necessarily. So. Look, and you mentioned Kant because you say, is it like the opposite to the Kant, or?
Yeah.
It is in a way, because for Kant the source of all possibilities is transcendental subject. So we need to understand that for Simondon there is no such thing as a subject which would be detached from milieu, from the world.
I would, if you are interested in this, I would recommend to read this, his introduction into his major work, the individuation in the light of forms and information. And it's like 30 pages read, and this is the dense read where he explains everything about his theory. And in that introduction, he says that, you know, basically, when you need to interpret individual, you always encounter the problem of face. Individual is the face in the process. It's not a given, you know. So, and he thinks about the potentiality that is never within the individual. No? So potentiality and the space of possibilities are outside. So when we speak about the compossibilities, they're never inside the individual. It's not, you know, they do not come from individual. They come from the relations, basically. Individual is a relative being, you know. So the problem of relations is how can you know, think, measure, describe, articulate, and so on. So it is different in physical world, it is different in psychological world, it is different in collective world, you know, and he has descriptions, you know, how relations that pre-exist, and he calls this process transduction, relations that pre-exist individual turn into something that is internal structure. There is this famous example of the crystal, you know, in Simondon, which comes from physical individuation. There is a solution, like solution, like la solution, like, so the saturated solution, when you put something in it and, you know, the crystal appears. So basically, the point is that the potential of the crystal is already in the solution, but it's not like let's say the relation of correspondence, you know, whereas it is the relation of change, you know, that in the solution there is a potential that to become the change in the structure. So we have to have this in mind when we think of compossibilities in the Simondonian sense. It's the fields of potentialities that are at stake here. So basically, the difference from the example with the crystal is that here we speak about a biological level where imagination is very important. You know, imagination allows you to see that sheer possibility within the shared milieu, in a way. And also, the other thing is that the idea of milieu opens up the idea of perspectivism, I would say. Because starting already from Canguilhem, we have this idea that milieu is never, we cannot define the milieu in stable terms. We say, this is an individual, this is a milieu. No. I am the milieu for my bacteria, but, you know, they are the milieu for the food they're digesting. You know, it depends where you put the lens. You find the milieu like differently. You know, it's a question of, in a way, of how you describe the face and how you see what's at the center. So basically, it's the focus. You shift the focus. That's why, you know, you are always the potentiality of otherness, and the otherness is potentiality of you. It's always, you know, inside, outside, it doesn't work. You know, it's like that circulation. And that's why there is no subject as pre-given. You know? Well, it depends where you start from. You know, and
since we always start from, a bit emphasized subjectivity, I would say. Of course, we need to think about the milieu that we discover from our point of view, POV. But it's not for Simondon. That's not a problem. He's not phenomenologist in this sense. He's not a Kant in this sense. He like shifts his lens from biology to society to physical and existence. So it depends where you put the lens. I don't know if I made myself clear.
Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for your talk. I'm gonna do my question in Spanish for utility. En un punto de la plática se hablaba sobre la capacidad de la imaginación para transformarse tanto uno mismo como el entorno. En este sentido, uno puede transformar el entorno creando objetos técnicos, ¿no? Y de estos se desprende pues la actividad imaginativa, ¿no? Pero igual se habla que, además de los objetos técnicos, la invención de los objetos técnicos, esta teoría de la imaginación puede llevarse a la creación de objetos estéticos, por ejemplo, que no tengan un carácter de utilidad, sino como de belleza, por ejemplo.
By responding to you, you can create technical objects, but can we speak about aesthetic objects? Yes. Well, of course, I think, of course, we can. We can speak about, and that the term of techno-aesthetics also appears not in this, but in other writings of Simondon. But and he speaks a lot about let's say symbols, works of art, and so on in his work and it's all incorporated. I have this feeling that there are elements that are well developed in this book, in this lecture series, let's say, and there are elements that are seriously underdeveloped. The aesthetic part is missing, I would say, in this work. If you read it, it's like the examples are very naive and very simple and like not too much. I mean, just he mentions them and you don't get too much out of it. But I think this is because he couldn't do everything in one year. It's one. Imagine he just had these lectures in '65 and '66, and then they released it in one volume. So that's why we have only, let's say, preliminary remarks towards it. What he does, he speaks about the phase of invention, which is, as I said, primarily technology, but then, of course, in that phase, he doesn't speak too much about other living beings, about animals, only in rare cases. For him, the basis of technology is the process of symbolization. Basically, what is the symbolization is enabling to return to the sameness, to recognize the sameness, as Cornelius Castoriadis put it. Quid pro quo is the essence of the symbol. You always see something as something. So basically, the identity is established in the process of symbolization, because you can decipher what is the flag of Mexico, and I can decipher. We may have different emotions, but we know that it's the flag of Mexico. The sameness. So this is basically where it all starts. The process of technology and the work of art is later on. But there is no proper aesthetics and interpretation of art in there, because aesthetics starts where you kind of dismantle the symbolical. I would say, you say it's not only this. You go further. So basically, that is what is missing. Yeah, but it's not like he couldn't do that, but I think it's a question of time, just like so. I would, if we spoke about the proper theory of art or aesthetics, very naive. It's not. I mean, almost nothing. But the presupposition of it, they're out there.
Thank you. Do you have any question? I have a question. Yeah, delay my. Ahí quiero contar otra cosa, ¿no? Sí, gracias. No, para. Se dio pena. ¿Qué pasó?
Thank you very much. My question is there any sort of limit? Well, let me begin again. Sorry. The metamorphosis between the subject with the milieu is what creates this energeia, in a sense of there is something in the subject, there is something in the relations between the milieu, there is something between the intensities, there is something also in the milieu itself, and there is another thing in the relation between a specific milieu and the otherness and the possibility of outside the world. So my question is, where is this, or what is the thing that enables us to make a scheme of all of these relations? Is it more of the thing between the mix of all of them, or does it reside more in the subject itself?
Yeah, that also regards the general presuppositions of Simondon's theory, as I mentioned. We need to think about all these points, let's say something inside, something outside, as phases. It constantly uses that dynamic and temporal terms. So for him, all the stability, let's say, of individual, he doesn't deny any individual. He says individual does exist and we can see the structure, and he puts a lot of emphasis on the structure analysis. What is the structure? But it's the face, So you can, for instance, when he thinks about the metastability, it's one important topic of Simondon's philosophy, the concept of metastability. It's neither the stability nor the chaos. It's the metastability. And I think that influenced heavily Gilles Deleuze, the idea of metastability. So the metastability is the disposition of a system for the change. So for instance, that solution, a crystal example is that a solution is so supersaturated that is ready to change. So metastable condition. But metastability, if you look, for instance, in chemistry, so the metastable molecules appear when you have, for instance, you try to I'm missing terminology in chemistry. So you try to, for instance, to mix two matters and to get a third one. Basically, in the lab you try to get some substance, and you mix two substances. So somewhere in the middle, in the process, you get the metastable elements, the metastable substances that you can't even observe. You know, they appear, it's in chemistry, it's a technical term in chemistry. Metastability in chemistry are the substances that are formed in the process of the reaction, but they do not appear for us. They just so fluid, so you know, not stable, that they turn into something else. But they exist, you know, in the process of reaction. So this is like also a metaphor to understand what is like stability and the phase for Simondon. You can see all the individuals, all the let's say internal structures as the elements that are so stable for a certain limit of time that you can't describe, you know, that are impossible to describe. And then, but they are still phases, you know. They have this temporal and dynamic characteristics, and that's why when we see that scheme, which is the scheme that I asked a fellow designer to draw. It's not Simondonian scheme. It's like just, you know, something that I interpreted. It's not like a closed individual of a subject. It's like phase of change. He's interested in the process of change, in transformation. So you can describe, you know, like a vortex in the water. You can describe, you can see, photograph, you can have some, you know, ways to deal with it. But you cannot say, oh, well, that's an individual we start from, you know. So basically, he very often uses the word tendencies. There are tendencies that lead you there, you know, and that's why it's genesis, you know, the tendencies that transform the structure in that way, you know. So basically, well, you need some points of references. That's why, you know, you have faces and you frame them. You frame the face, but actually it's not like inside, outside. It's just a face. And go on with the question.
So,
yeah. I will take also yours. No, so go ahead.
So after the question of Sophia about the interpretation of visuality,
Yes.
I was thinking, well, that was the point of what I tried to come across when I visited that after criticizing the centrality of visuality and insisting that imagination has not a lot of visuality nor language, I think now we are able to ask again about what image is. Because then if we start saying that it's a clear image, and it's an individual, like a dead, like it's imagination but dead, like just a piece of imagination that is not active. I think we have a certain problem, no? Because the idea is about the process and the possibilities, and I think that we have to insert in the image and the work of art and this cycle. So I was thinking, for example, the idea of Kant about work of art that produces a lot of thought, and maybe that would be a funny way to insert the question again, because a representation, not necessarily a work of art, but a representation could lead to further possibilities in imagination, in action, and not only as a clear image, but as a point in this cycle. So the example I was trying to present back then was how they deal with the landscape, because landscape is tended or could be thought as this image of the world, which is this association image. But the critique of landscape is from the imaginary point of view. It is just a social imaginary about nature and society. But if we change the point of view with imagination about dealing with the milieu, then the landscape became just a point of reference, because you see how this theorists talk about, you can imagine how you would walk around the place. You use the landscape to deal with the space. So the interpretation of the landscape became also a point of view where you could put this image again in the cycle of imagination, and not only as objectifying and so on.
I think I need, to make one point very clear. Maybe that this tendency to emphasize not the devoid of imagery in the animal imagination, could create a false assumption that I kind of think that it is possible to imagine in human terms without images, or to deal with the imagination, avoiding the question of image. I think when we speak of, although there are cases, very interesting cases of aphantasia, it's a topic of, for me, for utmost importance. Aphantasia, where people who cannot have imagery, like visualizations, but they can imagine. But these are specific cases. Although there are these cases, human world, symbolic world, is structured in narrative and visual terms, and I don't even think we need to resist that. It's like like, for instance, now we speak and communicate through language, and can say no. It's like it's so charged with ideology, with metaphysics, and so what we do. Well, we cannot do philosophy by touching, maybe, but or by feeling smell. Yes, but it would be difficult. We still talk. So it's the same regards to imagination. I think it's so the history and being embedded in that context is so powerful that we need to think about alternatives, as you say. And I know your work on the landscape. I totally agree with you that there are different, let's say, ways to see how image works, and primarily dealing with representation. Let's say, if it's a representation, or it has some alternative ways to maybe become indicative, maybe become choreographic, maybe become dialectical, and so on. So I think images are many things, but the recurrent point of criticizing that animals and, for instance, other living beings do not have imagination is that they don't have eyes and that they don't speak. So that's why I was focusing on that, But like we turned into the human world, it's a bit different story, because we deal with different problems. Of course, most of us can see and speak, and that's why we need to find spaces and I would say dialectics in that to open up new possibilities, So yes, of course, our possibilities emerge out of this. And also in Vilnius, you remember I talked about Gorilla Coco, that's an ape who was managed, who was taught how to speak in gestures, gesture language. So she knew she could say 1,000 words and she could understand 2,000 English words by showing signs, sign language. I would say that that's also the case when you can see that shared possibilities, compossibilities, you know, because she was taught and she entered human world, she was given proper education, she went to a good school in Los Angeles, and she managed to acquire not a good imagination, because we say she is so imaginative, she almost created poems, and she could grieve because her pet died and so on, but because our shared compossibilities, shared possibilities of symbolic world are apparent. You know, we can see how her imagination works because she entered into the human symbolism. Not because she was taught to be imaginative by us. She was taught our symbolism. So that's only, you know, the thing that I was trying to, maybe I'm just dealing with the part of, for instance, Darwin was the one who said that only humans have imagination, you know, and that's a prerogative of man, you know, not the human man, you know. So that's the question I'm dealing with, you know, that a long tradition of saying that animals are not creative, they cannot imagine. So, but when we enter into the human world, that's a complex, different story, you know.
Pero, lo puedo hacer en español.
No entiendo un poco.
Bueno, muchas gracias también. Un gusto. Y bueno, en este, creo que hasta donde entendí, imaginación e imágenes son dimensiones distintas, ¿no? No tiene que ver demasiado. Entonces, por ejemplo, en y yo quisiera ahora enfocar un poquito más a la capacidad humana de la imaginación, no tanto con la cuestión de los animales, porque bueno, lo hice yo de mi tema, ¿no? Pero por ejemplo, ¿tú has notado o has visto algún cambio en la capacidad de este ciclo o en este ciclo de imaginación con respecto a los aparatos técnicos? Porque son aparatos que son súper sofisticados, que tienen millones de posibilidades. Y bueno, no sé si, bueno, al menos por ejemplo yo me siento abrumado con una cámara fotográfica. Yo siento que ahí ya no puedo imaginar y que estoy en mi capacidad, por ejemplo, de invención, la siento disminuida, ¿no? En este ciclo, ¿no? Poniendo, digamos, mi capacidad ahí en ese sentido, ¿no? No sé si tú lo has notado o si tienes algún trabajo que hable con respecto de eso.
Es una pregunta muy interesante.
Y, perdón, esa es una. Y la última es, sí, muy rapidita nada más. Entonces, en este sentido, es una gran imaginación. No existiría las imaginaciones. Y es esa sería nomás.
Sí, pienso. The first one is regarding how do the technical objects affect that cycle, and yeah.
We
we keep a limit because you kind of feel that your camera limits your imagination in a way, and the other one is a plural or one imagination on many imaginations.
Sí, o si hay, no demasiado, tampoco. Unos cuantos. ¿Madre? Sí, por supuesto, sí.
The first one is a very important question, and I think in a way this is also where Simondon stops, and Stigler with Adorno, with others, you know, starts to come into play with all the critical theory and so on. You know that Adorno, Flusser, of course, but I say about Stigler because, as I mentioned, he directly was influenced by Simondon, but he kind of
what he did. He provided all this, let's say, cultural critique of cultural industries, based on, for instance, Adorno, who, in dialectics of enlightenment, Horkheimer and Adorno had this irony towards Kant. For Kant, it's like, oh, that there is this enigma and the mystery of schematism enrooted in the human soul. And Horkheimer and Adorno said, well, the enigma of schematism meaning enigma of imagination, that it's enrooted somehow, we don't know why and how imagination provides the schematism. And they said, well, I think this enigma was solved by Hollywood, because they schematize our experiences. And that's a very important point. I think that we need to see the Stiglerian perspective in this case, because it's very much related to the points that you are talking about. Of course, techniques is the most powerful limitation and as well as opening of imagination. It's you can. It's not like that you have this relation with your camera, but you can see that people cannot orientate themselves without GPS nowadays. Like they cannot go. They don't know where north and south is anymore. So of course, techniques transforms your relation with the environment. So I think we have this idea of pharmakon in Stigler, pharmacology, in Stiglerian sense, where he says that techniques is both, it comes from Plato, Derrida, and so on, but techniques is both poison and a cure for our imagination as well. Meaning that it puts a lot of limits because it provides a certain way of understanding possibilities. How can you photograph? How can you move? And the only way to deal with that pharmacology is to understand that it's poisonous. Like when you take drugs, not like drugs, but drugs from the pharmacy, you need a prescription. You need to say, I have this ache here, so I need this substance. So the same regards to techniques. You always need to be technologically conscious of the amount and the impact that it does on your possibilities and imagination, because they limit. If you get stuck in watching kitten images on Instagram, that's what your phone does. It's a limitation of your world. You don't see anything else. But the phone can be a wonderful thing, even to save people's lives and to open up processes of emancipation in political sense. It can be many things, but you constantly need to see that pharmacological nature here of technology. So there is this element in Simondon. It is not developed, but there is this moment when he says that technology is a new anticipation. So this is exactly where Stigler, as I said, starts. He says he provides this Kuleshov effect. The montage of Kuleshov, where you see the same face by actor Mozhukin. Kuleshov was a Soviet filmmaker, So you see the same face, but you interpret it differently because the image that goes beforehand is a soup. So you see that he's hungry in his face. Or you can see that he's grieving because you see the dead body beforehand. So basically what comes first defines your anticipation. And that's what technology does, So you see hunger, you see grief, you see joy, because technology constructs your mind in that sense. So you constantly need to go back, to see that you already were formed by your anticipations. And that's a critical procedure. That's why you need, like, in a way, critical theory in order to deal with technology and art. So, of course, that's the liberation of imagination, which is always our fight. And there's ideology, and there's so responding to your first question. The second, imagination or imaginations in the human world, Well, in a way, it depends what you want to describe. I do think that we have, for instance, I'm interested in that indigenous epistemologies and indigenous imaginations in a way, and I'm still, a beginner, but I read a lot of work in anthropology, and I'm interested how it works not in westernized, world. So I think that there are a lot of moments where imaginations function differently. But still, I think they're related to that drive of the cycle, which have different configurations. That was described by Simondon. In a way, it's biological, let's say. It's like the life. Imagination and life are interconnected, but when it gets articulated, then you have different imaginations. So what not being perfecting, it's saying we're all connected, but in a way, yeah, there is this connection. Like we all come from one evolutionary process. So imagination is kind of that articulation of a drive in a way, But it can have a lot of varieties. Like we're different from reptiles, of course, and nobody wants to deny these differences. But to see both, basically the unity and difference, that's maybe the importance.
¿Puedes hacer la metáfora? Porque
sí, como
ya están afuera.
como quieras.